Сьогодні ми в Українському культурному центрі OMNI у Торонто на лекції професора Лубомира Luciuka.
Lubomyr Luciuk has been a professor at the Royal Military College of Canada since 1990 and has been active in the Ukrainian-Canadian community for many years. Professor Luciuk is the author, editor, and co-editor of 32 books and monographs, as well as over 225 opinion editorials published in Canada's leading newspapers. His research interests include the political geography of 20th, 21st century Ukraine, Canadian ethnic and immigration history, and refugee studies. Among his recent publications are the co-authored volume Enemy Archives, Soviet Counterinsurgency Operations and the Ukrainian Nationalist Movement, McGill Queen's University Press, 2023, and the booklet, The Galicia Division, They Fought for Ukraine, 2024.
Пане професоре, сьогоднішня лекція в Українському культурному центрі OMNI у Торонто саме на яку тему?
Well, tonight I'm talking about Soviet and Russian disinformation directed against Ukraine and Ukrainians, particularly in the diaspora. For decades, the Ukrainian community in Canada has been subjected to a wide range of Soviet-era propaganda regurgitated by the Russian Federation, its operatives, and fellow travelers here in the West. It's portrayed us as Nazi war criminals, Nazi sympathizers, as ne'er-do-wells of various kinds in history. And that campaign against Ukrainians in Canada, and indeed right across the diaspora, has escalated ever since the escalation of the war against Ukraine orchestrated by the KGB man in the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin. So what I've noticed as someone who's been engaged with this kind of topic all my academic life for 35 years is that we had an intense period back in the 1980s during the Commission of Inquiry on War Criminals headed by Mr. Justice Dulles-Deschênes. Some of your viewers will remember that. And then it kind of went quiet more or less. And now, never before have I seen such intensity, such viciousness, such underhandedness as I have in recent years. And I think that's because, frankly, never before in history has Ukraine been as well known as it is today, and never before in history have Ukrainians been admired as much as they are around the world because of their valiant defense of the homeland against the predatory neighbor. And because of that, the Russians have escalated the propaganda, and they've brought back all the same old stuff that they used to say back in the 80s, and this has reached a crescendo. It's become very bitter, very personal in some cases, directed against me, but others as well. And it is a sign of desperation on the part of the Russian Empire, which is losing the war. They've already lost the war psychologically, spiritually, because of the well-known defense that Ukrainians have generated against this aggression. But more than that, they've lost it, I think, spiritually. Their imperial project now is finished. It's finished for all time. The Ukrainians never were, aren't, and never will be Russians, and now the whole world knows that. So, Mr. Putin, you lost. Last laugh is ours.
We suspected in 1984, 85, 86, 87, that it was the Soviets who had planted propaganda, disinformation, misinformation into the Western society, into the media, about how Canada was refuge for Nazis after the war, particularly in the Baltic and Ukrainian communities. But we had no proof. We had no proof until literally a few years ago, and some of you have heard me speak about this book before, Operation Payback. We found documents in the KGB archives. Here it is. In the KGB archives that prove that it was the Soviet KGB that deliberately planted information in newspapers like the Toronto Star, the New York Times, and so on, that planted stories about Nazis in the Ukrainian community, collaborators, war criminals, all the bandita, all that stuff, in order to provoke tension between the Jewish and Ukrainian diasporas.
Дивіться, я зараз запитаю ще одне таке питання відносно дітей. Дуже багато українських дітей тепер є, їх забрали, їх далі, вже забирають. Ваша думка, що з ними буде?
Well, this is part of the genocidal campaign that Mr. Putin is waging against Ukrainians. The removal of children, the kidnapping of children, let's call it what it is, the rape, the torture, the murder, this targeting of civilian infrastructure, all of these things as a package are part of this genocidal agenda that Putin, the KGB men, and the Kremlin and his confederates have put together. What will happen to those children? Well, they must be returned to Ukraine. And of course, the trauma they've experienced psychologically, spiritually, and so on is something that will probably take a long time to address. But children, thankfully, are more resilient than people my age, so hopefully they will be able to bounce back from this and perhaps even learn from it, learn who the Vorokh is. The enemy we faced in the Tsarist Empire, in the Soviet Empire, and in today's Russian Federation is the same. And every generation of Ukrainians has to relearn that sometimes, unfortunately, in a very tragic way, because that's the only way Ukraine will remain an independent, free country in Europe, in its rightful place.
Допомога світу і новий президент Америки Дональд Трамп. Як ви вважаєте, що станеться?
That's a good question. Побачимо. I'm going to be very careful here. I think that many of us were afraid that Mr. Trump, as the president, and he is the president-elect and he won the election, would take drastic measures that would be negative for Ukraine. But that hasn't played out yet. We haven't seen yet. Some of his advisors are strange people indeed, but many of them are more serious. And so I think it remains to be seen. We'll have to wait on that one. But I don't think that the fear that many of us had, say, even a few weeks ago, has played out. We've seen that Mr. Trump has been in some ways bombastic, but in other ways much more measured in these last few days. It's only a few days old. I retired on Friday and he became president on Monday. So I mean, let's give it a week or two, shall we?
When Vladimir Putin actually announced his special military operation, he said that he was sending his troops into Ukraine to get rid of the Banderivci. It's exactly what he said. And within a day or so, they started saying Nazis. Why? Because, come on, ask your neighbor. I'll give you $100, tell me what the Banderivci were. A band? Nobody knows, right? The West doesn't know. There isn't that depth of historical interest among most people. So the story changed. We're in there to get rid of the Nazis. Even in the West, and you've all heard this, people started to say, whoa, wait a minute here. President Zelensky is of Jewish heritage. He's a Nazi? It's ludicrous. We all know, and I've said this before and I don't mind repeating it, Ukraine has in President Zelensky Moses. He is leading his nation out of captivity. He's leading them away from the empire of the Pharaoh, Putin. Now, we may have our different opinions about Zelensky and his future. Look, now he's Moses. Moses didn't get to the promised land either. But now he's Moses. And because of his leadership and his character, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition, right? Probably the most famous line of this war. Ukraine has survived.
Канада далі буде допомагати Україні?
Oh, I think it's very clear that regardless of the political party that comes into government in Canada, whether it's the Liberals returning to power or the Conservatives, Canada, because Canadians in general, will stand with Ukraine. Unfortunately, Canada can only do so much, and that's one of the big problems. We alone cannot rescue Ukraine. Ukrainians have to fight for themselves. Canada can help, our European partners can help, but it's going to take a coalition of the brave and the willing to resist the aggression of Moscow and its allies in some of the lesser countries of the world, like North Korea and, of course, Iran, and unfortunately the People's Republic of China.
Професор Люциук, персонально тепер до вас. Отут є 4 знимки ваших книг, які вже були опубліковані. І скажіть, чи ви далі працюєте над чимось?
Sure. As I said, I've retired on Friday, the 17th of January. All that means is I have more time to do the kinds of things that I want. So I'm already working on my memoirs, which I think will be a very interesting book indeed. But a small booklet on the Ukrainian nationalist movement is in the works. Similarly, something on the Holodomor. I have a number of projects that I'm involved in, and on the Divizia, for example, the Vatican archives, Foreign Office archives on the Divizia. There are, if I sort of sit here and think, 4 or 5 book projects on the horizon. And hopefully, God willing, my health will hold out and I will still be able to get these things done. So I thank all the people who are watching this who have supported me over the years because, as I say, I've been a professor for 35 years at the Royal Military College of Canada and 32 monographs, so almost 1 a year. But that's only because of the support I've received from Ukrainica, from the Shevchenko Foundation, from the Temerte Foundation, from a variety of different supporting organizations right across our Hromada, big and small. And I'm very, very grateful for that. I could not have done it without our Hromada. Simple.
Дуже гарно відповіли. І ще одне питання. Архіви. За скільки років, тому що ви згадали, вони відкриваються, що можна до них дійти і подивитися?
It all depends on the archive and it all depends on the topic. Sometimes the archives are open within 30 years. Those would be the norm in places like the Foreign Office records in Great Britain. Some, like the Vatican archives, are closed for much longer, and some may never be open. Professor Viatrovich from Kiev and I did the one book, Enemy Archives, which is available. And those archives were made available, then when they were closed, and then they were made available again, and so on. So it's, as a researcher, you sometimes find that material can be available to you at this time, and then that same material isn't available a few years later. So I have always been very keen on publishing in English translation documents that speak to the Ukrainian question, whether it's from the Vatican archives, the British archives, the American or Canadian archives, and more recently, of course, with enemy archives from Ukraine and the Soviet Union. So that will hopefully lead to young scholars in the next generation rethinking and reevaluating how the West, as well as our enemies, regarded Ukraine and the Ukrainian question in the 20th and 21st centuries. Because I think there's a lot we can learn from looking about in the last century with respect to what's happened in this one.
But the interesting thing that I found out about my baptism was that the priest, the Baptist in this case, was Father Marko Stek. And if you don't know who that was, look into it. Because Marko Stek was actually one of the Studite priests who worked with Metropolitan Sheptytsky to rescue Jewish children during the Holocaust. He was the one who provided them with false baptismal certificates and gave them safe passages to monasteries and churches across Halichina during the Holocaust. So that's the man who brought me into the faith. And I was held by my 2 godparents. One was Nina Deneha. She was a survivor of the Holodomor and a woman who lived a long life and who eventually I buried. And when the time came to clean out her house because there was no one else, I remember going to her home and finding her kitchen, her larder, absolutely stocked with food. 12 bags of sugar, 20 bags of flour, 10 bags of rice, and so on. The local food bank probably put up a plaque to my memory because I had to give it to someone. She had survived the Holodomor and she never forgot what that was like, and she talked to me about it. And then the other person in the room, well, among others, was my godfather, my so-called uncle, my adopted uncle, Yaroslav Operyuk. He was a very delicate man, quite the opposite of me, but he was very supportive of me all my life. And in his papers, when he passed, I found a poem that eventually we inscribed on his tombstone in St. Mary's Cemetery in Kingston. And I'll just read you a portion of it because I think you'll realize why it's important to me. So his poem. I lived as I knew how. I labored as I could. I did not forget about God or my people. I studied, I read, and thought, connecting every little word. I recorded lines of words for my children's sake, so that they would love and not shun their own Ukrainian people. That's been the agenda of my life, and I thank you for supporting me for all those years.
But look at the world we live in. North Korea is immune. Why? Because it has nuclear weapons. Israel is immune because it has nuclear weapons. Pakistan and India have nuclear weapons. But Ukraine somehow, and I remember at the time, the debate, someone actually wrote a very scurrilous editorial in the United States called Ukes with Nukes, you know, nuclear-armed Nazis. Again, part of that same, these are all a bunch of Nazis. Well, you know what? Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons because it was reassured, or so it thought, that the United States and the United Kingdom would come to the rescue if its sovereignty or territorial integrity were threatened. Well, yes, they did, but did they do it enough? And the answer is obviously not. And how many tens of thousands of Ukrainians have been maimed or killed or displaced or kidnapped or tortured or suffered trauma because Ukraine made the wrong decision? And that's partially also because in that immediate post-Soviet period, the mentality of so many of our leaders, so-called, and even of the Hromada more generally, was Soviet.
On behalf of the Ukrainica Research Institute and the League of Ukrainian Canadians, we would like to present you with a precious little album created by an artist specializing in foreign affairs, George Butler. The title of the album is Ukraine, Remember Also Me, Testimonies from the War. Remember Also Me is also an appeal by Taras Shevchenko in his appeal to the Ukrainian people from his testament. Remember Also Me. So, our dedication on this little precious album for you reads, Dear Lubomyr, Ukraine will definitely remember you for your valued contribution to knowledge about Ukraine and Ukrainians. Godspeed on your retirement and a new busy chapter in your life.
Для Форум ТВ із Торонто Костянтин Снісар та Лариса Баюс.